At the most basic level, politics involves making choices that divide people into in groups and out groups, or more bluntly, into us versus them. Politics is the art of managing conflict, and conflict is defined by the incompatible claims of distinct groups. Who gets what in an environment of scarce resources? Depending on one's perspective and goals, people can be divided into just about any kind of fraction you can imagine. Consider how a scholar might want to analyze the in groups and out groups of New York City. A Marxist, for instance, would study these groups as classes and focus on their roles in the process of production. A Weberian would divide groups into status hierarchies and compare and contrast them. A feminist thinker would divide groups on the basis of gender, while a critical race theorist would use race as her operative division. In each case, we're talking about the same collection of human beings, studied from different viewpoints. All societies are crisscrossed with different cleavages, representing boundaries between groups defined in terms of class, race, gender, religion, nationality, ethnicity, and so on and so on. What W.E.B. Du Bois called the color line has divided Americans into categories of us and them since the early days of settlement. Anytime we discuss whiteness as a status category, a quality that allows a person to claim certain benefits of American life denied to others of a different color, we are discussing a cleavage in American life that has proven to be the source of intractable conflict. Many of these cleavages, these possible sources of conflict, are dormant for long periods of time. For instance, the Protestant nativism of 19th century America that separated Catholic outsiders from homeborn Protestants was a serious source of conflict until the New Deal era, when changing social dynamics ended this particular conflict. By contrast, the more recent influx of Muslim immigrants has activated a previously dormant cleavage, one that seeks to treat Muslim Americans as outsiders who can never really be part of the in group. As the Zolberg and Woon reading suggests, the cleavage activated by reactions to Muslim immigration in the US is far less prominent than that same cleavage is in Europe. As the authors argue, though Europe has become very secular in the past century, its deeply rooted Christian tradition provides an emotionally resonant basis for opponents of Muslim immigration to appeal to the old patterns that divide Christian and Muslim into implacable enemies. Just last week, centrist French President Emmanuel Macron issued a demand to the French Muslim religious establishment, demanding that they endorse the French Republic's ethic of secularism and abandon many outward expressions of their faith. Though this demand is rooted in the particularly French tradition of militant secularism, it draws upon popular unease with the arrival of immigrants who appear highly distinct from the mass of the French population. The religious division here is not so much driven by deeply felt belief. Most French Catholics are Catholics in name only. They fall back upon a Christian identity as a means of contrasting themselves with a group of others who share a distinct religious tradition. According to Zolberg and Woon, this is a conflict between insiders and outsiders, with religion serving as the publicly recognizable symbol of division. In fact, because Muslim immigrants tend to be more religiously observant, they present a kind of double threat to both the idea of a Christian Europe as well as to the secular modernity that underwrites French culture. The arrival of a large Muslim population in France has not spurred a Catholic revival, but it has reinforced the faith in secularism that many French people see as integral to their identity. One reason why the kind of religious and communal tensions that have marked Muslim immigration to Europe have not been repeated in the United States is because the American tradition of religious pluralism helps to diffuse these tensions in ways that European societies cannot. By contrast, the cleavage in American society that tends to provoke the most bitter conflicts between insiders and outsiders involves language. Muslim immigrants to Europe bring with them cultural, religious, and social practices that differ sharply from French norms. But even the most rabid French nativists do not worry that the French language will be replaced by the language of the newcomers. American nativists do worry about this, and regularly warn that the English language is threatened by the native tongues of immigrants, especially Spanish. Since the 1965 immigration reforms, the single biggest source of new Americans has been Latin America. Nativist politics in America has been dominated by the question of language, with fear of immigrants intertwined with fears that America's language based identity was in peril. Notably, this theme recurs throughout the history of American nativism despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Nativists feared that German and Gaelic would swamp English in the 1850s, while in 1900 the grandchildren of German immigrants warned that Italian and Yiddish would overturn English as the common American language. So it is today with Spanish. Ironically, we are often warned of this danger by people who are themselves the descendants of previously vilified immigrants, and who almost certainly cannot speak a word of their great grandparents' mother tongue. But this just underscores the fact that it is not the Spanish language that is a threat, but the language is a symbol that contains a vast fund of grievances and anxieties. It is these grievances and anxieties that shape the process by which in-groups and out-groups are defined. Zollberg and Woon note, though, that Spanish does have some qualities that set it apart from the languages of previous migrant groups. First, Spanish is the first language of more than half of the immigrants who have arrived in the United States since 1965. Earlier immigrant waves were more mixed, with multiple languages in play. This mutual incomprehensibility between newcomers accelerated the adoption of English as a common tongue. Indeed, many first generation Americans of that era reported that their own parents discouraged them from using any language but English. In contrast, Spanish itself provides a common link for immigrants from different parts of the Hispanophone world. An immigrant from El Salvador and an immigrant from Chile come from very different countries, but they share a mother tongue in the United States without need of English. Relatedly, Spanish has as long a history in North America as English. San Francisco and Los Angeles and San Antonio and Santa Fe were obviously not named by Anglo settlers. These places were all conquered by American forces in the Mexican War, and their populations became Americans by law while retaining their own Spanish cultural networks. Hence, it is entirely possible for Spanish speaking immigrants to come to the United States and become Americans without ever needing to depart from a Spanish language cultural context, because that context is as American as the Anglo one that nativists insist on exclusively. Hence the symbolic nature of the language issue. The supposed threat that Spanish poses is really a way of describing fears of cultural inundation. The Anglo nativist tradition is largely defined by these anxieties. In its earliest form, it held that the only genuine Americans were the descendants of British Protestants. The assimilation of Irish and German Catholics broke down some of this religious exclusivity, leading to an emphasis on the importance of the English language to bind together the American mainstream. This identification of Americanness with English was especially important in assimilating the immigrant waves of the early 20th century. And in this case, the assimilation of Italians and Jews and Slavs required a modification of the nativist ideal yet again, in which religious and ethnic pluralism was acceptable under the protective umbrella of whiteness, an in group category that encompassed the descendants of most European immigrants against Black, Native, Latin American, and Asian outgroups. Most of our contemporary discourse regarding so called identity politics ignores these sorts of mass categorizations in favor of dissecting the intricate differentiations of identity within socially marginal groups. This kind of study is important, but so is the recognition that identity politics encompasses far broader political conflicts. The movement for Black Lives and the Allied movement against police brutality are engaging in this kind of broader identity politics, which is at root a struggle over what it means to be an American and to be an equal citizen. Conversely, MAGA and Trumpism embody a particularly virulent form of identity politics that relies on the fundamental belief that Americanness is inseparable from whiteness. Whiteness itself is a shifting category, capable of assimilating people once defined as non white. This kind of adaptability suggests the basically political nature of this kind of identity, which is fundamentally a means of defining an in group and policing its boundaries. In fact, one could argue that far and away the most prevalent form of identity politics today is nationalism, which claims that one's national identity overrides all others. Seen in this light, one could understand identity politics as a driving force behind the most elementary dynamics of the international state system, which we will discuss next time.